types of whiskeys that I enjoy, and I'm all too happy to do it. I was thinking about doing that anyway. I'd like to preface this by saying that I am in no way a connoisseur. I have come to the whiskey game kind of late, and I really can't tell you too much about individual distilleries or lots of different really esoteric variations between different kinds of whiskey. I don't feel as though I'm really in a position to judge what is universally good whiskey or bad whiskey. I just don't have the experience and frankly don't have the educated palate for it. What I can tell you is what I like and what my experience has been with a bunch of these different kinds. First, I figured I'd start out with just a little bit of background as I understand it. So the three types of whiskey that I've had are bourbon and Irish whiskey and Scotch. Scotch being my personal favorite, but I'll get into why a little bit later. All of them are very similar in their compositions, but there are some pretty big differences in the way that they're put together. So first off, bourbon is something that it's American in origin. You're really not going to find European companies making bourbon, although I'm sure there are some. Bourbon is whiskey that basically it's defined under NAFTA, and it is supposed to be distilled from corn. And so that mash is made out of corn. It has to be no more than 80% alcohol by volume. Although I can't imagine what a bourbon would taste like that was that alcoholic. It would just be awful, I think. It has to be aged in charred oak barrels. And so those are and I think it has to be for like a minimum of a couple of years. It has to be aged. So bourbon typically tastes very smoky, very woody. There's a lot of real sweetness to it, and I think that sweetness comes mostly because it comes from a grain mixture that includes about more than half corn. And corn, as you know, is used, the natural sugar from corn is in pretty much every processed food product that we eat. So corn is one of the naturally sweetest occurring pieces of produce in nature. Now, Irish whiskey has to be made in Ireland, obviously. If you've got whiskey that's made in America, it can't be called Irish whiskey. And a couple of other things about Irish whiskey. It has to come from a continuous distillation. The distillation process has to do with malted barley. And it has to be distilled 3 times. And by distilling it 3 times, it produces a whiskey that is a lot lighter in color than, say, Scotch. And it has a more neutral taste to it. It's a little bit softer on the palate. I would say if you're drinking whiskey for the first time, Irish whiskey is actually a really great place to start. It's kind of a good starter whiskey. But it's also something that as I've come to appreciate lots of different kinds, I always come back to it. It's very comfortable. Chances are if you're in a bar, they're always going to have at least 1 or 2 Irish whiskeys on, kind of in bottles. Now, Scotch is widely considered to be kind of the Cadillac of alcohol. And Scotch is also made, just like Irish whiskey, it's made from barley and water. Now, the difference is that whereas Irish whiskey is distilled 3 times, Scotch is distilled only twice. So as a result, you have a liquor that is darker, that's a little bit stronger in flavor. And it also takes on a real smokiness because the barley that's used in the mash is sprouted and then it's dried over a peat smoke. And peat is that kind of moss that's out on the moors in Scotland. So it lends a very distinctive flavor and aroma to the whiskey. And just like Irish whiskey, Scotch has to be made in Scotland. It can't be made anywhere else. It must be distilled there. Okay, so those are some of the basics. I'm sure I'm leaving out lots of other subtlety, but this is just kind of how the basics as I understand them. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a couple of my favorite kinds. So Scotch is my absolute favorite, so I'm going to leave that for last. And I'll talk about bourbon first. it's a big college drink. And in fact, generally when you go into a bar and you ask for like a whiskey and coke or whiskey and soda, something like that, it's going to be some kind of bourbon. And I drank more than my share of bourbon in college. And my favorite one was Jack Daniels. And Jack Daniels is incredibly sweet. Depending on what you've had for a meal, like depending on how clear your palate is, it can be almost cloyingly sweet. It tastes to me, now that I drink more scotch and more Irish whiskey, when I go back to Jack, it's almost like a dessert. Jack Daniels, I don't recommend drinking on the rocks. You really want the flavor there. It's not overpowering. It's not overwhelming. It doesn't really burn as you drink it. It's very warming. And drinking it with ice just dilutes it way too much. So that's Jack Daniels. The other kind of bourbon that I like is Maker's Mark, which is, and you'll recognize Maker's Mark, it has a really distinctive bottle. It's the one that has kind of, looks like melted wax over the top of the bottle. It's like red wax. Very similar to Jack Daniels, but I find it to be a little bit mellower and not quite as pungent. Easier to sip and not really as cloyingly sweet. So your choice there just kind of depends on your preference in terms of sweetness and aroma. Now, part of the reason that I stopped really drinking bourbon was that, and this may be a complete myth, this was just my opinion, when I drank bourbon, even if I didn't get, tipsy or drunk on it, I found myself getting kind of aggressive, and I really didn't like that feeling. I've really noticed that different kinds of alcohols will make me feel different ways when I drink a lot of them. And bourbon left me with kind of a buzz that I really didn't enjoy. So I kind of have said goodbye to that. So the next level up, in my opinion, is Irish whiskey. And I haven't really experienced a whole lot of Irish whiskey. I just have one that I really like and I've kind of stuck with. My favorite Irish whiskey is Jameson. And if I can afford it, I'll get a bottle of the Jameson 12-year Special Reserve, which is essentially identical to the regular Jameson, but it's aged in special casks for more than a decade, and it really tastes very refined. I love the smell of Jameson. I've actually got a little tumbler of it right here. It's got a very distinct kind of woody flavor to it. You can really smell the barrels that it's aged in. And it's very easy to sip. It's not overly sweet. It's not overly tart. It has that same really nice warming effect as you drink it. There's a little bit of spiciness to it as you drink it. And it's just very pleasant in general. I drink Jameson sometimes neat. Sometimes I'll have a little splash of water, or, if it's the summer, I don't really like drinking whiskey neat a whole lot, so I'll have a couple of cubes of ice. But not too much. It's really light. It has a very delicate flavor, and I don't like to dilute it. The other kind of Irish whiskey that you'll see a lot in bars, especially, is Bushmills. And Bushmills is, for my money, it's a little bit cheaper, usually a couple of bucks per bottle, cheaper than Jameson. But worlds apart in terms of quality. It's passable. Like if a bar only has Bushmills and doesn't have Jameson, and I really want Irish whiskey, I'll have some. It's a weaker flavor. It already tastes kind of diluted when you drink it. It's very easy to drink, and I think in that respect it's kind of a dangerous alcohol. There are a couple of kind of no-neck monster white hat frat boy bars around where I live, and you'll see lots of those guys pounding back the Bushmills. I think largely just because it's so easy to drink and so easy to get drunk on. So I'm always going to go for the Jameson when given the option. Alright, so Scotch. Far and away my favorite alcohol, and I really don't know. There's just a world of information about Scotch. You've got people, there are all these different regions of Scotland where very distinctive kinds of Scotch come from, and people will swear by either the Highland Scotch or the Speyside Scotch. And there are a couple of other different reasons, and they'll really stick to those. My palate is really not developed well enough to tell tell the difference between all of those. So I have a few that I like, and I don't really know their histories. I just kind of know what they taste like. The most popular selling Scotch in the world is Glenlivet 12. So Glenlivet, very big, very old distillery. Obviously 12 means that it's aged for 12 years. I kind of hate Glenlivet. It is weak, it's watered down. It's obviously, people see it as a very accessible Scotch. Like if you're going to start drinking Scotch, it's very easy to drink it in comparison to some of the others that have been aged a lot longer. But it's poor. If you're going to spend money on a Scotch, don't spend your money on Glenlivet. Same really goes for the Glenfiddich as well. You'll see that in a ton of bars. My absolute favorite Scotch, which was introduced to me by a friend, is from the Macallan distillery. I like the Macallan 12-year. I think it's a really great blend of affordability and quality. So a bottle of Macallan 12 is going to run you about $40, like in a Bevmo, something like that. And that seems like a lot of money. But you have to understand, most people are not drinking Scotch to get drunk. They drink it because the taste is really interesting, and there's such great varieties in taste from Scotch to Scotch. So a bottle of Macallan, for example, I'll buy a bottle of Macallan 12, and then it'll last me for a month or two, because I'll just sip at it ever so often. It's very pleasant, especially at the end of a hard day. I find the Macallan to be smoky, but not overpoweringly so. It has that nice kind of peaty taste to it, but it's not oppressive. There's a degree of sweetness there. There's also woodiness. There's, I'm going to sound like a pretentious ass, but there's kind of hints of vanilla sometimes when I'm drinking it or when I'm smelling it. Sometimes it tastes a little fruity, like there's some kind of bitter cherries or something in it. It's just a lovely taste. Really great to sip. And I'll usually drink it on the rocks, even though most serious whiskey drinkers will say, most serious Scotch drinkers will say, you gotta do it neat. I like the cold. I like the sensory experience of hearing the ice. I like the way the ice feels against my lips as I drink it. So I tend to drink it on the rocks. Another Scotch, kind of a notch up in price, that I really love is the Oban 14-year. So a bottle of the Oban 14 is probably twice the cost of a bottle of Macallan 12. But, oh my god, it's worth it. It tastes peppery. There's a spice to it. But, again, not oppressive. It's really lovely. It's a Scotch that I think, I'm a vegetarian, so I can only posit, but I think it would go really well with meat. Like a grilled steak or something like that would taste excellent with an Oban 14. It's just thrilling. It's a little bit thicker than the Macallan as well, so there's this excellent mouthfeel to it, and it's a delight to drink. Another kind that I've tried recently that I'm kind of hooked on is the Dalwhinnie 15-year. And the Dalwhinnie 15 is very thick. It's almost like a liqueur. And that's pretty much the only Scotch that I would serve chilled. Like if you chill it, you can almost drink it as a dessert. I've also, strangely enough, I've had the Dalwhinnie 15 chilled over ice cream. Like a coffee ice cream. And it just tastes amazing, or like like a French vanilla ice cream. So that's a really good option as well. That, like the Oban, is expensive. It's actually a price point in between the two. Alright, so I'm running out of time. So I hope that's been interesting or informative. Got lots more to say about whiskey, but I'm out of time for now. So thanks for listening.